Well, good morning, everybody, and thank you to Graham and the HRB for the invitation, and also congratulations to HRB on your 30th birthday. So, the title in your programme says Shoe Leather Policy, and the title on the screen, Research, Practice, Policy and Evidence, I suppose is my subtitle. But my message to those of you who are academics here is if you're a successful academic in the world of policy, it is actually about shoe leather. And I'll spend the next 40 minutes or so explaining what I mean by that. As Colette said, until a couple of years ago when I retired, I was the Director of Public Health at NICE. And our two offices, one in London, actually isn't in Admiralty Arch. It's in a rather nondescript office building next door, but Admiralty Arch makes a rather nicer photograph. But it was in a rather nondescript office block in Manchester near Piccadilly Station. My job was to develop the guidelines on the promotion of good health and the prevention of disease, and ranged across a range of key topics. If it had been a simple matter of researchers doing the evidence in the universities, NICE assessing it and then developing guidelines, and practitioners and policymakers then implementing it, which is the model which is supposed to be what goes on, then actually my job wouldn't have been very interesting at all. In fact, you probably wouldn't have needed me or NICE. But my job was extremely interesting because that model of knowledge translation and implementation is a rarity, and the reality is rather different. Now, the kinds of key public health problems which I was responsible for developing guidelines on are the obvious public health ones. Tobacco and tobacco control, the misuse of alcohol, the obesity epidemic, the problems of lack of physical activity in the population, the misuse of drugs, some communicable diseases, sexually transmitted infections, HIV, AIDS, TB, and hepatitis, for example, as well as a range of mental health problems. We developed guidelines on all of these matters. Now, of course, the problem and the difficulty is that in each of these areas, the answers are far from simple, and yet the politicians and policymakers want simple answers to these complicated and difficult problems. You'll be familiar with some of the imagery of the sorts of issues we're dealing with. This is a delicious snack I spotted in New York City. I rather like this. My daughter, who lives in Boston, sent me this. Our American cousins are even further ahead in the obesity epidemic than we are in the UK. I particularly love fried cheesecake. Isn't that really, perhaps even peanut butter jelly, anyhow. And this imagery, representing a rather different problem, which appeared in our media with a lot of frequency about a decade or so ago. This isn't Pose. This is a place just around the corner from the NICE office in London. You can get alcohol served for 24 hours every single day. Again, our American cousins have been at it before breakfast. That was in New Orleans, the bloody screwdriver breakfast. Now, the fact is that if you're dealing with this type of problem, you have a range of players and agents in the causation of the problem, as well as a range of potential evidence-based type of solutions. And our task at NICE was to work our way in that interface, the politicians, industry, evidence, the academy, practitioners, and people whose job it was to implement change at local and national level. Now, what I'm going to do now is a bit of a historical excursus and reflect to you what I think is one of the underlying difficulties which attends to all of this public health work, and to some extent to any of the issues which we've been discussing in the first section this morning, and I'll call it the long shadow of cholera. This is a cartoon that appeared in the Times at the time of the 1854 epidemic in London, where John Snow found lasting fame for proposing that the cause of cholera was something in the water, though he didn't have a clue what it might be, but he observed that water was involved in the transmission. He famously is alleged to have removed the handle of that pump, the Broad Street pump, and once people stopped getting water from that particular well, the epidemic apparently subsided. There's some matter of historical doubt about whether he actually did that, but what he certainly did was plotted the number of cases around Soho and linked them to the water supply. Another person who's involved in what I've called here the shorthand history of public health, a man called Sir Joseph Bazalgette, perhaps less well known in medical circles than John Snow. This is his photograph. Bazalgette was the engineer that was responsible for the construction of much of what we see along London's river today, along the River Thames. This is perhaps his most famous construction, the Thames Embankment, which is that wall you can see underneath what is Hungerford Bridge or Charing Cross Bridge, where if you're on a train coming into Charing Cross Station, to this day you still come in on that bridge into the station. But it's underneath the embankment that the interesting public health works are taking place. You can see, first of all, the pipes there that contained the clean water, and the larger pipe underneath which contained the sewage. And Bazalgette constructed the sewage system across North and South London, which by the end of the 19th century had made London a very clean city indeed. There's also 2 railways running there. If you've ever been on the District or Circle line, you've travelled along Bazalgette's embankment construction, where the railway runs to this day. An extraordinary feat of engineering, the largest beam engines ever constructed to do the pumping of the sewage. It's absolutely a monumental construction task and a monumental public health success. So in the shorthand history, here we have Snow with his genius for spotting connections, and Bazalgette, the engineering genius, for sorting out a means of control. And of course, we mustn't forget the scientists who beavered away to actually identify eventually the microorganisms, most notably in Germany, Koch, Lister in the UK, and Pasteur in France. Interestingly, Koch and Pasteur were at each other's throats for their entire careers, although when you read their manuscripts now, the conclusions they were reaching on communicable disease and microbiology, they're very, very similar. You have to put it down to the fact that one was German and one was French, rather than anything different in the science. And this, of course, is the bacterium, the Comobacterium, which Koch discovered in India as the causal agent in the development of cholera. So we have a simple set of solutions to a set of complex problems. Put simply, the 19th century has come to be seen as one of progress in which eventually, by the end of the century, germ theory had triumphed and the public health measures which had eradicated deadly infections like cholera reigned supreme. If it were that simple. The pathogenic paradigm, as Aaron Antonovsky called it, is based on this idea. If you can identify the cause, then acting on that cause will provide you with a solution. Tobacco, alcohol, obesity, physical activity, drugs, communicable diseases, and mental health. Where's the Bazalgette? Where's the Koch? Where's the Comobacterium? Where's our Lister? And where is the answer? Now, when you go in to talk to the politicians, they think you're going to be the new Bazalgette. Because in my experience of 10 years at NICE running the public health programme, 5 years before that the Health Development Agency, is that consistently policymakers and politicians were yearning for quick and simple solutions to those problems and others, and solutions which they thought would look pretty much like the eradication of infections in the 19th century. But of course, the world hasn't yet been able to provide something as simple as that. So what's evidence and research and the implementation problem that I'm going to focus on got to do with that? Well, in the shorthand version, we have the heroes. The reality, of course, is that cholera and a solution to cholera had been worked out in the 1830s by a doctor called Thomas Latter in Leith, near Edinburgh in Scotland. And he realised that dehydration was what was causing the death, and if you could rehydrate the patient, so I'm talking 1830s, in other words, 60-odd years before Koch discovered the bacterium, he had a solution. It disappeared into a medical footnote, only to be revived years and years later. The Broad Street pump, right enough, well, that was a facsimile photograph I showed you of it, is a wonderful piece of apocryphal history. But actually, although Snow was able to argue the case in 1854, by the time you get to 1856, Snow's pioneering work was largely forgotten as policymakers moved on to some new and different problem. And the Thames Embankment and all of Bazalgette's great engineering works like Putney Bridge, the Woolwich Ferry, and all these other things that Londoners still enjoy today wasn't a done deal. It faced years and years and years of opposition from all kinds of vested interests who sought to stop London getting itself cleaned up over nearly a 60-year period. And even great reformers like Edwin Chadwick, who's known for his the great sanitary movement, also gave the Victorians one of its worst pieces of social endeavour, namely the Victorian workhouse. He's a very mixed blessing indeed on English society in that period. Now, to understand all of this, I'm going to take another excursus, this time into psychology. And for me, the book of the decade of the 2010s, Daniel Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Thinking Slow. If you read this book, you probably only need to read about the first 3 or 4 chapters to get the argument. Kahneman, of course, has been enormously influential in psychology, in things like nudge theory. He influenced Thaler and Sunstein's arguments about nudge and behavioural economics. But Kahneman is much more than behavioural economics and nudge theory. Let's do a little experiment. How many of you can give me immediately your thoughts on Brexit? Everyone in the room's pretty much got an answer to that. Now, I want you to, in your heads, not writing it down, divide 37,925 by 17. Can anyone do it? Now, of course you can't, unless you've got a calculator or unless you are an arithmetical prodigy. Now, what's happening there? In the first case, you were using your fast thinking. You've got an immediate answer to a problem that you've probably thought about a bit, but you can get to your position very, very quickly. On the other hand, to do that mathematical calculation or arithmetic calculation, you need to do some careful working out. You probably would need to write it down and go through what laboriously we learned at primary school. Now, there are 2 examples. Well, he doesn't use Brexit as an example, but they're 2 of the ideas at the heart of Kahneman's fast and slow thinking. We as humans use 2 cognitive sets of processes in our everyday lives. We use shorthand fast thinking, or what Kahneman calls heuristics, to arrive at quick answers to complex problems almost all of the time. And it saves us having to go back to first principles and work out what to do. When I used to commute into London every day, it was very interesting to watch the commuters on the railway station, because I'd see the same people every morning. They all got the 7:25 into Charing Cross. And they never talked to each other when they got to the platform, but without fail, the same people went and stood on exactly the same place on the platform every single morning. And then when the train came, they got in the carriage and sat in exactly the same seats. And woe betide if someone was already sitting in that seat who didn't normally travel on the 7:20, they'd kind of look at them and ask, put a bit of pressure on them to get them to move. Now, what's going on there is actually operation of heuristics. We stand in the same place, we get and go sit on the same seat on the train because we're not bothering to think about what we're doing. On the other hand, there are decisions and things we have to do which do require complex thinking and going back to first principles. We can't do that first principle thinking for everything we do, because if we did, we'd never make a decision. But some things in life do require us to slip into that slow thinking mode that Kahneman talked about. Now, the trouble is, with many public health and policy problems, is this draw to think fast all the time about causes. There's a simple cause of the effect. Let's act on the cause. It's a simple linear relationship between these different, whatever the phenomena are. And certainly in England, but I would argue much more broadly than that, across the United Kingdom, WHO is very guilty of this, in my view, and almost everything the EU says on the matter of non-communicable diseases reduces it down to one very simple idea. It's about behaviour change, stupid. Because if we can get people to behaviour change, get them to change their behaviour, they'll stop smoking, they'll take more exercise, they'll eat more healthily, and Bob's your uncle, gone is the obesity epidemic, the epidemic of heart disease and the rest of it. Well, yes, we've been telling people for decades that these things are bad for them. We've been telling people for decades they should be getting up, walking more, running more, all these other things. Does it happen? I was listening to Dame Sally Davis last week, and it's about 3% of the English adult population over the age of 50 that meet the Chief Medical Officer's recommendation on exercise. Probably about the same in Ireland, much the same certainly in the US and beyond. If it was so easy to change behaviour, we would have done it long ago. Of course, the problem is that psychologists have beguiled us, really, by telling us they can predict. I love this cartoon, you know? Isn't that great? Watch what I can make Pavlov do. As soon as I drool, he'll smile and write in his little book. But underlying that joke is, of course, the notion that is derived from Pavlovian psychology, that human behaviour is essentially predictable, easily predictable. It is predictable up to a point, of course, but it's not completely predictable, and that's the difficulty. Now, so far, I've blamed policymakers and politicians for thinking fast about these matters, but it isn't only them. Actually, academics and researchers do exactly the same thing, even though academic research, scientific research, by definition, is about thinking slow. And I'll give you some examples of these sorts of thinking fast about practice. Okay, I'll do the research. Someone's going to take notice. I know dozens and dozens and dozens of colleagues who think once they've had that acceptance in the peer-reviewed journal, job done. Job done. Don't have to worry about it after that. And it's a nice linear relationship between this research that I've spent my last 3 years on my last big grant doing. It'll turn out okay because there's a nice linear relationship between what I have found and what goes on out there. If I do the research, guidelines can be developed. You know, people will pick them up and work with it, and off we go. And that's a nice linear relationship too. I sat on the REF panel. Now, the REF panel, that's the Research Excellence Framework panel for all UK universities for Unit of Assessment 2 two and a bit years ago, evaluating impact. And you'd be amazed how many researchers in the UK in the realm of public health said, well, my piece of research was mentioned in a nice guideline, so it's had an impact. A footnote in a guideline, that's impact? Well, so they were claiming. A nice linear relationship. Now, if you begin to think slowly about the problem, actually, the linear model works a bit of the time, but we have to think of other ways of conceptualizing the relationship between research, implementation, practice, and policy. And beyond the linear, simple model that I've described so far, I think there are 4 others that we need to talk about. The first I'll call the momentum model, the back burner model, the trade in ideas model, and finally, the title of my talk, the shoe leather model. Now, the momentum model is, I suppose, the one that is most easy for us to recognize, because what it implies is that you can build up, if you like, a head of steam, a momentum. If the volume of research, the volume of findings moves in a particular direction for long enough, it will actually have the effect of changing things. Well, that works again some of the time, as do some linear models. In the case of tobacco control, I think the linear model now works extremely well. We've got a mindset in policymakers, a mindset among the population even. There are very few committed smokers who don't know of the dangers of smoking. And so we can think of that linear model helping us to make the changes that we want to. But it's really important to remember, in the case of tobacco, that it's been a very, very long journey from 1950, when Dolan Hill published the first paper identifying the link between cigarette smoke and carcinoma of the lung, and the smoking bans in this country, in Scotland, and then in England, the smoking bans in public places in the 2000s. It's depended on the build-up of a critical mass of both public and scientific opinion that was the direction of travel in which the evidence would take you, and the politics followed. It's also taken political will. In 1962, the Royal College of Surgeons in London published its definitive report on smoking and health. Now, believe it or not, on the day that the Royal College of Surgeons launched their report, they held a press conference. And at that press conference, the then Minister of Health, wasn't called a Secretary of State in those days, the Minister of Health, a man called Sir Ian MacLeod, received the report from the Royal College of Physicians and launched it to ladies and gentlemen of the press. Throughout the press conference, Sir Ian MacLeod smoked. Perhaps the most extraordinary thing is that the Royal College of Physicians had ashtrays which allowed him and the journalists to smoke, but they did. But don't forget, of course, in 1962, when Macmillan's government received that report, 3/4 of the men sitting round the cabinet table would themselves have been smokers. And the sorts of implications arising from the science, which those data clearly signalled, was simply impossible to imagine. The health education, the bans on smoking in public places, the price rises, and all the things that have become the stock in trade of the tobacco control movements. And it's never a done deal, because even though now we live and work for the most part in environments which are smoke-free, don't forget the tobacco industry is still there, waiting to jump in at the first opportunity it gets. And perhaps the biggest opportunity it's got at the moment is with smokeless tobacco, or rather e-cigarettes, I should say. Never a done deal. And of course, what the tobacco industry did, it simply shifted its operations to the Far East and to developing countries where the markets were still developing in the 70s and 80s. The momentum model is a bit like the linear model, but it's about this build-up of critical mass, and people talk about tipping points in the momentum model. But critically in the momentum model, you get a political moment when something happens where a politician or a leader actually grasps the nettle of bringing about the change that's required. And there are two cases that I would draw to your attention in this regard from English public health, British public health in the last 40 or 50 years. Barbara Castle, the feisty Minister of Transport in Harold Wilson's government, and her bringing through of the drink driving legislation in 1967, the Act of Parliament came in. In the teeth of opposition from her own political party, the teeth of opposition from drivers' organisations, the teeth of opposition, obviously, from the alcohol industry. But the evidence was there from the Grand Rapids study in the States that even a small ingestion of alcohol impairs your ability to drive and makes the likelihood of a crash greater and makes the likelihood of death in the crash greater. The evidence was there from the late 50s and early 60s. Castle took the decision to go with it. And of course, you saw immediately the legislation came in, changes in the habits of people drinking, and this sort of stepwise drop in the number of road traffic deaths in the UK. Another pioneer on the other side of the political spectrum, Norman Fowler, Secretary of State for Health in Mrs. Thatcher's government, who effectively gave us the Safer Sex campaigns and the needle and syringe exchange campaigns, which effectively helped to contain the AIDS and HIV epidemics before we had any drug treatments. And the only solutions were the safer sex models, and preventing the spread and the leaching out of the infection from the intravenous drug-using population. But there's an anti-momentum model as well, which is to say when the build-up of the evidence is thwarted by similarly by politicians or by politics. I was very interested in listening to the Minister this morning, who described a seamless relationship between politics and evidence in Ireland. That's certainly not the case in England. And I will point to what I regard as the sorry tale of the prevention of alcohol misuse in the UK. These are some data showing how from the early part of the century we saw a decline in the consumption of alcohol, and moving into the 2000s, a gradual increase back to levels from the beginning of the previous century. This is another one of I like this one. Good old Mr. Spot. In the UK, we had 3 different types of problem relating to the misuse of alcohol. Harmful and hazardous drinking in extremis, the familiar problem of people drinking very, very high levels of alcohol with organ damage and end-state organ damage. But overall levels of population alcohol consumption, illustrated by that previous graph, everybody is drinking too much, not just the people who we might label as alcoholics. And the third problem of public binge drinking, especially among young people. They're 3 different problems, they're not the same problem. NICE was asked to take that problem on, and in 2010 we produced this guideline, Alcohol Use Disorders Preventing Harmful Drinking. And I stand by every single word in that document still. And on price, we said actually minimum unit pricing is the way to bring down overall population level consumption, and it deals with the problem of young people who drink too much and the extremist people, because both groups, young and extremists, migrate to the cheapest forms of alcohol. Regularly review that minimum unit price and also have a look at alcohol duties. Alcohol was just too easily available. We went through a natural experiment in the 1990s where, relative to wages, alcohol got cheaper and cheaper and cheaper, and you could buy it in places you never could buy alcohol before. We got rid of off-sale principles. Every shop can sell it, every supermarket, every garage, on motorways, everywhere. We're awash with alcohol. So we talked about differences in licensing legislation, making licensing authorities think differently about availability, and imposing the sanctions which actually already existed in law. And then marketing. The notion that marketing has nothing to do with the alcohol problem, and we suggested at NICE reviewing the advertising codes to ensure limits on advertising to under 18s, especially in the world of social media, which isn't regulated at all, and a stringent regulatory system to go with it. Well, the policy narrative always looks for certainty rather than the uncertainties that exist in evidence. The policy narrative doesn't really worry about the difference between models, empirical evidence or theory, and tends to be very untroubled by some of the artifacts of the research process, at least until the research comes up with something the policy narrative doesn't like. And so the day after we issued the guideline, this was the headline in The Independent: "The government rejects watchdog's alcohol policy." That's nice, the watchdog. Never understood that. I won't go through this, but basically it says the government clashed with its medical advisors yesterday, and what then happened was our own Department of Health issued a counter briefing to what NICE had to say, arguing actually that NICE didn't understand its own evidence. What a laugh. The one thing you couldn't accuse NICE of was manipulating or not understanding the evidence. But sadly, the Secretary of State thought that we didn't understand the evidence. And actually, there was a beautiful nuance in the statement from the Secretary of State. In that last quotation in the bottom paragraph, it's not clear that NICE's research examines specifically the regressive effect on low-income families of minimum price. Now, that's a touching, isn't it just touching? They're so caring about low-income families not being able to afford to get boozed up as much as they please. So, the momentum model runs into politics. And I should say the problem of alcohol and what to do about it rolls on and on and on. The trade in ideas model is something quite different, which says actually we shouldn't think about research there, policy there, practice there. What we should think about is what's going on between all of these people is a trade in ideas. It's not the specific findings at any given moment that are important. What is important is the exchange of those ideas over time, building the momentum, getting the ideas there for people to talk about. There's a lovely book written by Dr. Catherine Smith at Edinburgh University in which she talks about this notion of trade in ideas. And what that means is you as a researcher have to spend time talking to policymakers. You as a researcher have to get close to journalists. You have to get people interested in your ideas. Don't rely on the university's press office, by the way, to do that. They'll undoubtedly get it wrong. You yourself have to become a credible source of information for people who need information and work in that economy of trade in ideas of different groups going on. Well, in conclusion, I've got a couple of three things to say. First of all, what we need to avoid is what happens so often, at least in the English context, which is a non-dialogue between the evidence producers and policymakers, where academics become concerned with the integrity of their science, rightly so, that all science requires a lengthy gestation period. That's true. But at the end of that, what's the key finding that comes out? We need to do more research. If you're sitting in Whitehall or in the corridors of power anyway, and the academic researcher comes in and says, yep, I've been working on this problem for 5 years, Minister, and what we need is more research, you'll be shown the door and you'll never get any more money. It's an obvious point, and of course we always do need more research, but that shouldn't be the principal argument that comes out of the research, and unfortunately it so often is. What we need to think about is the definition of the problem, because from a policymaker's point of view, the problem is now, not in 5 years' time, not when we've done yet more research. I need an answer now. If I'm sitting at the policymaker's table, I need an answer that makes sense, that helps me with my heuristic, because that's the way I think, and doesn't require me to go off and do some complicated calculation like 33,000 blah, blah, blah. Instead gives me something I can work with. Policy questions are seldom the same as scientific questions. We need to see about the convergence between those things. If we forever say, well, my interesting scientific question is this, your terrible problem with alcohol is that, or at least your terrible policy problem with alcohol is that, you won't get very far. We need to think about the conjoining of those questions as one. And also, always remember, if you're sitting on the research side of the fence, that political questions are foreshortened. At best, you often get no more than about 3 minutes when you're with a minister or a senior policymaker to explain what your research says. And 3 minutes isn't very long. It's that, what I think our American cousins sometimes call the elevator moment. The academic narrative is something, too, that we need to be self-consciously aware of. If we're researchers, we shouldn't just assume that it's obvious because my research demonstrates it's obvious. It may be obvious to us as scientists, but that doesn't mean it's obvious to the people who are interpreting and reading it. And so you really, really need to think about what the implications are of what it is you're doing. The second key thing is never adopt this notion, if you are a researcher, that the implementation is nothing to do with me, it's not my problem. It is your problem. If you want your ideas to have an influence, you need to think about how they will be implemented and who will be implementing them when you're doing the research. Not some afterthought, not some bit of a grant application that says pathway to impact, but think about it at the outset. Whose mind do I want to change? Whose practice do I want to influence by what I'm doing? Not, I want to impress my clever friends at the university of somewhere very old up the road. It's also important not to simply comfort yourself from the research point of view by saying, well, politics and ideology, well, that's an anathema to science. Science doesn't do politics. Actually, science does do politics, and science has to do politics well if it's going to be successful. It's also very foolish to imagine, if you're sitting in the comfort of a university research department, that policymakers and politicians are either rogues, knaves, or fools. If you underestimate them, they will underestimate you. There's a newspaper that sells very popularly in the UK called the Daily Mail. You may have heard of it. Now, the Daily Mail runs consistently anti-nice stories. Compulsory reading for every member of the senior executive team in NICE was the Daily Mail. The worst thing we could have done was underestimate that newspaper. It's a good newspaper, a wide readership, and it's written extremely well. It just happened to say rather unpleasant things sometimes about us, well, until Dame Sally Davies got the title, I was the super nanny of the nanny state. But the mistake would have been to dismiss them as fools and idiots and so on. They're not. They're clever people, and you need to engage with them. And that's certainly the case when we talk policymakers and politicians. And it's also, we need to think, yes, we always need more funds to do more research, but we need to be able to develop value for money and demonstrate that that's going to be good for the world of other people beyond the world of our research. So remember this from a disinterested eye. I've had a foot in all of these camps over the years. I was an academic, as Claire said, for 27 years. Then I went to work in this sort of semi-governmental role, working with politicians. And I suppose my concluding comments are these. Good academic work and good policy making are both difficult. They're not easy. They're both difficult. And they both require slow thinking, not easy heuristic answers. There's nothing wrong with slow thinking in those contexts, so long as we can work our way through it. We must also always remember that pull of fast thinking to get to a quick answer, that pull is very strong. And it's easy to sometimes to be drawn into that easy answer notion. And then when that little aside I said there of be careful what your university press offices get up to, because they can try and big up a story, can sometimes make it sound much simpler than it actually is. And we've seen many public PR disasters with research down the years where that has happened. Get in there and mix it with the policymakers. My reference to shoe leather is you've got to get out and talk to people. You've got to get out and walk the corridors of power, wherever they are. Get yourself known as a researcher. Get yourself trusted as a researcher, and make it known that you're there to be called upon. It's not a waste of time. It's not something that other people can do, not you. It's something that is worth every hour of investment in getting the ideas into practice. And that's true whether we talk about politics or practice or the broader type of community. There's also the back burner principle that I alluded to briefly, which is today sometimes you need to keep building the evidence. It's not that it will have no impact, but rather the impact will find its political moment in due course, keeping it bubbling away. So when the opportunity arises and the minister is looking for some answers, you've got them ready to go. It may mean that sometimes, therefore, our findings have to sit, as it were, without people taking very much notice immediately, but they can come into their own. Some of the things we've seen on smoking, for example, fall into that category, but there are many other examples too. And perhaps most importantly, if you are a researcher, you should have an account of why what you're doing will work for the policymaker and the end user. Now, whether that's the hospital administrator, whether it's the minister, whether it's the local clinical commissioning group, or whoever it is, you need an account of why it's important for them. And preferably all of them. And what you shouldn't try to demonstrate, because this puts people right off, is why you are a brilliant researcher and just how clever you are. You may well be, you may well be, but that doesn't give the answer to the person who's got to change things and make things happen. Evidence-based policy is a great idea, but it's far from simple. The evidence-based approaches, as exemplified by organisations like NICE, offer us the best bet by building material for the back burner, for building momentum, and as the basis for the trade in ideas. but researchers have to get there and mix it with the policymakers, the journalists and the politicians if they want their ideas to be taken seriously. The knowledge systems for producing evidence and producing policy are different. They operate in different universes, but I don't believe that in the end they're irreconcilable or incommensurate, so long as we make the effort to bring them together. And I think that's the point at which I'm going to stop. Thank you.